Coming up, a new approach to intervention.
Macro-level policies, strategies, institutions, and discourses are not the only determinant of peace-building effectiveness.
Barnard professor Séverine Autesserre draws on her experience in the Congo to advocate for new peace-building strategies. It's just ahead on Global Ethics Forum.
It's really a great pleasure for me to introduce Séverine Autesserre tonight. Séverine is an old friend. She's an assistant professor of political science at Barnard College. Her recent book, Peaceland, examines international peacekeeping interventions and their shortcomings to date.
Tonight, I would like to speak about one of the centennial themes of the Carnegie Council, war and reconciliation. How can we end violence? How and why do former enemies reconcile and eventually decide to create shared institutions? And what are the ethical demands of peace building in societies divided by war? I have spent the past 15 years studying international peace-building initiatives, mostly in the Democratic Republic of Congo and also in various other African and non-African countries. And during this fieldwork, I constantly witnessed a puzzling pattern. International interveners kept using, reproducing, and perpetuating ways of working that they themselves widely viewed as inefficient, ineffective, or even counterproductive. For instance, it is now conventional wisdom that local ownership is essential for successful peace building, but local stakeholders are rarely included in the design of international programs. Scholars and practitioners regularly emphasize that using universal peace-building templates is ineffective, and that context sensitivity is crucial. And yet, interveners often use models that have worked in other conflict zones that are not appropriate for the specific local conditions. Local people and interveners themselves deplore the expatriates' tendency to live in a kind of bubble where they interact mostly with other expatriates and where they lack contact with host populations. And yet, this phenomenon still recurs in virtually all areas of intervention. Why? The persistence of these inefficient modes of operation is all the more puzzling because interveners, as you know, interveners are not indifferent or callous. Most of them do care about the effectiveness of their actions. They're not stupid. Most of them are intelligent, well-read, well-educated people. They're not immoral. Most of them go to conflict zones animated by a strong moral values to help people and countries affected by violence. And they're not even oblivious to the consequences of their standard practices. Some of them are actually very uncomfortable with the way international peace building operates on the ground. Why then do interveners contribute to perpetuating modes of operation that they know, that we all know, are inefficient, ineffective, unethical, or even counterproductive? What I also found striking when I was in the field is that a number of individuals and organizations ignore or even actively challenge the international interveners' dominant practices, and they suggest alternative modes of operation. The existence of these exceptional cases raises two questions for me. First, what can we learn from them in terms of increasing the effectiveness of international peace building? And second, why haven't they managed yet to convince their colleagues to adopt the alternative modes of operation that have proved to be more effective? Identifying the factors that impact the effectiveness of international peace building is of critical importance to scholars, to practitioners, obviously to people living in conflict zones. Admittedly, international efforts can succeed only when warring parties are ready to stop using violence and when local, national, and regional peace-building capacities are strong enough to make peace sustainable. But despite their limitations, external contributions can make the difference between war and peace. there has been a number of studies at the micro level and at the macro level that have shown that international support significantly increases the chances of successful peace building. And so when we look at the explanations for the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of international peace building, we see that they focus on, for instance, material constraints. For instance, whether or not peace builders have enough funding to implement all the projects that are necessary to reestablish peace. They also focus on vested interests, as in peace builders prioritize either the pursuit of peace, which promotes peace building effectiveness, or they prioritize the pursuit of their own personal, national, organizational, or professional interests. And as a result, their project effectively promote these vested interests, but they have little effect on the actual construction of peace. And the last kind of explanation focuses on the imposition of liberal templates and values. Many scholars argue that Western liberal values orient interventions towards strategies that are inadequate and that are inappropriate to local conditions, and that this leads to peace-building failure, while efforts and international interventions that are contextually sensitive are much more effective. What I found in my research, and the central message of my new book, Peaceland, is that the everyday dimensions of international peace-building efforts on the ground also strongly impact the effectiveness of intervention efforts. And by everyday dimensions, I really mean mundane elements, such as the expatriate social habits, standard security procedures, or habitual approaches to collecting information on violence. I also look at the influence of the informal and the personal on formal professional initiatives. And in my research, I demonstrate that everyday practices shape the overall intervention from the bottom up. They enable, constitute, and help reproduce the macro-level strategies, policies, institutions, and discourses that other researchers usually study. They also explain the existence and perpetuation of ways of working that interveners themselves widely view as inefficient, ineffective, or even unethical and counterproductive. And I want to clarify from the start that my approach and existing explanations are not mutually exclusive, but instead they're complementary. Another important point is that my argument is not that we should eliminate support for international peace building altogether. There is, in fact, a wide consensus among scholars and host populations that external support and external expertise are often, not always, but often necessary for successful peace building. Let's trace how interveners come to know their areas of deployment. The first thing to do is to focus on the struggle over which and whose knowledge matters in Peaceland. In the current international system, the most valued expertise is that of interveners trained in peace building, humanitarian, and development techniques, and with extensive experience in a variety of conflict zones. In contrast, and although there are exceptions, the knowledge of country specialists is much less valued, and the knowledge of local people is usually trivialized. International and non-governmental organizations, just like diplomatic and donor missions, usually do not rely on anthropologists or historians who could help interveners gain an in-depth understanding of their work environment. Instead, they hire operational experts who have done the same technical jobs before. In terms of promotion and status, intervention structures value the number of missions in different countries, rather than the amount of time one spends in a particular mission. And in fact, the interveners who stay too long in a specific place are considered to have gone native, and they are thus discredited. The consequence is that of all the expatriate peace builders that I met, only a few had pre-existing knowledge of their countries of deployment. All of the others had been hired on their substantive and technical capacities. Valuing thematic knowledge over country-specific expertise results from various social dynamics, including the process of professionalization of international peace building, which has increased the effectiveness of intervention programs on the ground. However, valuing thematic expertise over local knowledge also leads to standard ways of working in the field that decrease the effectiveness of intervention efforts. For instance, it legitimates the deployment of people who do not speak any of the local languages, even though on the ground, everyone identifies the intervener's lack of linguistic ability as one of the main obstacles to effective peace building. And it leads to high turnover among interveners, which has a lot of negative consequences, such as loss of institutional memory and a lack of understanding of local context. Even more importantly, valuing thematic expertise over local knowledge asserts the superiority of the international staff, who are viewed as having the consequential knowledge, over local employees. In virtually all aid and peace-building organizations, whether diplomatic, international, or non-governmental, expatriates are in management positions, and local people make up the staff. Very few local people make it into leadership positions in their countries of origin. If they want to move up the hierarchy, they have to go abroad and become expatriates. And let me tell you a story that illustrates how the very fact of being local changes the way interveners relate to a person and his ideas. One of my interviewees, Michel, was a Congolese businessman. He's still a Congolese businessman. And Michel is from a mixed background. He has Belgian, Portuguese, and Congolese ancestors. And Michel was frustrated by the way interveners behaved toward him and toward other Congolese elite. He thought that interveners were talking down to local counterparts and that they didn't take local ideals into account. So, during a meeting abroad, Michel conducted an experiment. Instead of introducing himself as Congolese, as he usually did, he pretended that he came from Puerto Rico. The approach in the meeting, he said, was completely different. He had much more credibility and much more influence when he passed as an outsider. Another consequence of the fact that thematic expertise matters more than local knowledge is that intervention structures very rarely solicit local input in the design and planning of their efforts. And this approach creates resentment among local populations, and it is at the root of the phenomenon of local contestation, resistance, and adaptation that lead to the failure of so many projects and programs. So, of course, local actors frequently resist international programs for their own benefits. For instance, to pursue their own personal, economic, political, or security interests, or just because they don't care about building peace. But not all local people have this kind of vested interest. And instead, most of them would benefit from more stable conditions, and many of them truly care about building peace in their countries. So we need to understand why the people who would benefit from successful international efforts instead reject or disturb them. And the main reason is the premium that interveners place on thematic expertise over local knowledge. In all of the countries in which I worked, local stakeholders complained that international peace builders were arrogant and that they provided aid in a humiliating manner. And my interviewees emphasized that the arrogance resided in thinking that the international ways of working are better than the local ones, and in failing to pay attention to local ideas. And what's really interesting for those of us who are interested in peace building is that I heard this kind of criticisms against all kinds of international programs. Not only those that were obviously shaped by liberal values, programs that, for instance, insist upon organizing elections, but also those that had no relationships with liberalism, such as programs that build foreign rather than local models of toilets to respond to water and sanitation emergency. And my interviewees were very clear. They said that they do not resist or reject the international programs because of their content, such as the supposed Western or liberal characters of the programs. Instead, they reject the very act of imposition, regardless of whether or not they like the strategies and the values that the program convey. And the international and non-governmental organizations that fight against this trend are excellent illustrations of the advantages inherent to valuing local knowledge on par with thematic expertise. The few comparative evaluations of their effort that I know show that these organizations are much more effective at promoting programs that are locally owned and locally supported, and thus effective and sustainable. We can then wonder how, in these circumstances, the international peace builders, those that are not exceptions, make sense of their environment. Interveners face multiple obstacles when they try to collect and analyze information on their countries of deployment. And this results in a lack of understanding of local conditions. One of the key consequences of the lack of in-depth understanding of local context is that it entices international peace builders to rely on simple and often overly simplistic narratives to design their intervention strategies. Adopting dominant narratives offers a useful way out of the predicament that international peace builders face given the poor quality of the information and analysis that they have. Dominant narratives emphasize a few themes on which to focus. Interveners can then believe that they have a grasp of the most important features of the situation, instead of feeling lost and deprived of the knowledge that they need to properly accomplish their work. But let's look at the impact of the dominant narratives on, let's say, the Congolese conflict to see what the perverse consequences of this practice are. In brief, in 2010 and 2011, when I conducted the research for this project, and even still now, three narratives oriented the general discourse on Congo and shaped the intervention strategies there. These narratives focused on a primary cause of violence, the illegal exploitation and trafficking of natural resources, a main consequence, sexual abuse of women and girls, and a central solution, reconstructing state authority. So these narratives achieved prominence because they suggested straightforward explanations for the violence. They also suggested feasible solutions, and they resonated with foreign audiences. Thanks to the reliance on these dominant narratives, the Congolese activists and international activists have managed to put the Congolese conflict on the agenda of influential decision makers in national capitals and headquarters. So that's great. But unfortunately, the reliance on these dominant narratives and on the solutions that they recommended has also led to results that clashed with their intended purposes, including an increase in human rights violations on the ground. The focus on mineral resources has diverted attention from other causes of violence and thus decreased the overall effectiveness of the international peace efforts. The focus on sexual violence has raised the status of sexual abuse. It has transformed it into an effective bargaining tool for combatants, and thus increased its uses. And finally, the focus on state building has merely enabled the Congolese government and the Congolese army to become more effective perpetrators of human rights violations and other kinds of abuses against Congolese people. And a number of Congolese individuals that I interviewed for this project, along with the exceptional individuals and organizations that I mentioned before, have tried to reintroduce more complexity in the discourse on Congo, but thus far without success. Various everyday elements make possible the counterproductive practices, habits, and narratives that I just mentioned. These elements include the expatriates' personal and social experience living and working in conflict zones, the patterns of social relationships among interveners and between them and local populations, the interveners' standard security routines, their advertisement of their actions, their search for neutrality and impartiality, and their focus on quantitative and short-term results. But what's really important to keep in mind is that all of these everyday routines have intended consequences, such as enabling interveners to function in conflict zones and enabling their organizations to help the host country build peace. But these routines also have unintended consequences. Notably, they construct and maintain a firm separation between expatriates and local populations, thus decreasing the overall effectiveness of international peace efforts. They also perform, make visible, and reinforce an image of the intervener superiority over local populations, which these populations strongly resent. And again, that leads to resistance and rejection. And again, the individuals who challenge these personal and professional routines, who develop personal and social relationships with their local counterparts, who forego standard security routines, and who maintain low profile and avoid advertising their actions. These people end up implementing programs that are much more effective. In sum, my new book suggests a new approach to the study of international peace building, an approach focused on the everyday dimensions of international peace building on the ground in conflict zones. This new approach produces findings that are different from those of existing research. While existing research emphasizes the differences among interveners, my research highlights commonalities among them. And in contrast to people who study the imposition of liberal values, I show that these commonalities reside less in shared ideas, such as a shared adherence to liberal values. They lie instead in the everyday practice of peace building on the ground. These new findings suggest a fresh answer to what affects the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of international peace building. Macro-level policies, strategies, institutions, and discourses are not the only determinant of peace-building effectiveness. The everyday practice of peace-building on the ground also matters tremendously. And it is by looking at these everyday practices and habits that we can understand why interveners contribute to perpetuating modes of operation that they know are ineffective, inefficient, unethical, or counterproductive. Everyday practices, habits, and narratives are perfectly understandable responses to the daily difficulties of intervening on the ground in conflict zones. They enable interveners to function in the difficult environments that they face. But they also have unintended consequences that decrease the effectiveness of international efforts. In conclusion, let me mention extremely briefly the policy recommendations that I have developed based on this analysis. Interveners could rebalance the role of local and thematic knowledge by following the model of the exceptional organizations that I mentioned during my presentation. Concretely, that would mean changing recruitment and promotion practices for interveners, relying more on local employees, creating tools and structures to involve communities in novel ways, and also creating tools and structures to gather input from the intended beneficiaries. In addition, we could break the boundaries between interveners and local populations by creating structures for better relationships between expatriates and their local counterparts, by promoting socialization between interveners and local people, and by convincing interveners to forego standard security routines and the requirement to advertise their actions. And local people could further help break these boundaries by changing the way they routinely interact with foreign interveners. Thank you.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.